Stephen O'Malley is co-founding partner of Civic Engineers. The firm is based in Manchester, London, Glasgow and Leeds, and it provides a wide range of engineering services from civil and structural to public realm movement and sustainability. And Stephen's got a special interest in placemaking and has worked on iconic projects such as New Islington in Manchester for Urban Splash, TfL's Sustainable Urban Drainage Guidance, Glasgow Avenues, and the Poynton Shared Space project in Cheshire. So Poynton seems to embody all sorts of aspects around collaboration and consideration, which are high on our agenda today as a result of COVID-19. So Stephen, is Poynton still working as it did when it was first installed?
Well, good morning, Peter. Yeah, I believe it is. I'm still in contact with a number of the people that were involved in the scheme, not least of whom is the politician, Howard Murray, who was the primary driver behind the initiative. It's interesting to observe, I think, that the project was conceived, it was delivered in 2012, and it's been operational since 2012, but it was conceived 2 to 3 years before that. So we're looking at 2009. So it's quite interesting that here we are over a decade later, and I think the primary ingredients of the scheme, and more importantly, the outcomes that it sought to deliver, have been achieved. I think, you know, the term shared space brings with it a lot of baggage. Some of it is fair and reasonable because there are some bad examples of shared space schemes, but it's too broad a label to really capture some of the good things. And I think in Poynton, what was occurring there was the fact that you had 20,000 vehicles rattling through this little settlement on a daily basis, and the impact of that traffic on that environment and that community was significant. And the Poynton scheme sought to reverse that bias, change the polarity, and subordinate the dominance of the traffic in the town. And I think it did do that. And the speed at which vehicles now pass through is in a much more considered and measured way. And with that, the overall high street or footfall quality of Park Lane, which is the street adjacent to the main junction, is thriving. And I know quite rightly that some of the disabled access groups have been using Poynton or been studying Poynton as looking for aspects of it which do or don't work. But I also think it's really important to remember those that live there, and some of the disabled people, blind people in particular, who actually live in Poynton. And they were facing the prospect of not being able to have a local shop to go and get a pint of milk, given the lack of vitality that was being affected by this negative environment. So I do think that there's a lot of positives there, but no scheme is perfect. And there's certainly a lot that we would, if we were doing it again, we would do more, not least of which would be to include more green infrastructure, more suds and more trees in the street and in the scheme.
Yes, well, I suppose times have changed, haven't they? In the early part of this century, hard landscape was all the thing, and now, of course, we're very keen on being a lot greener. But you said in the past that soft power and emotional intelligence aren't historically words attributed to property and construction. And if we've learnt anything from 2020, it's how to bring emotional intelligence closer to the way we lead and the way that we design. So how does that position influence the way that you work?
Well, I think it's particularly pertinent for engineers, of which I'm very proud to claim that discipline and that profession. And I think if you look back to engineering heritage, look at some of the great engineers from our past in the forms of Bazalgette or Bateman, the impact that they had in Glasgow, bringing fresh water into the centre of the city, or Bazalgette dealing with cholera and reshaping the entire landscape around the embankment. That, you know, those guys brought with them a much greater understanding, I feel, about how their decisions were impacting on the communities that they were there to serve. I think some of that got lost as we saw the likes of Corbusier come in with living machines and started to sort of think of the human being as a sort of unit of some form or another. And then that started to manifest itself in policy. I mean, then you have in 1946, you have the New Towns Act, and then you get this detachment, particularly from an engineering perspective, about the different components of our lives. Perhaps best example of which is Ernest Marple's introduction of the Buchanan Report in the 60s. And this is the point at which we start to see segregation in a very serious way. And from an engineering urban infrastructure perspective, you start to see a greater dispersal of the amount of things or facilities and services that we want in our lives as human beings, distributed over a much larger area. And the way to get from one to the other has been the car. And actually, engineers have then been siloed into these different disciplines that have been pursuing the delivery of individual components along that journey. And I think what we need to do is almost pivot back, circle back to our roots as engineers and start to think of these things in a much more composite fashion. And this is where I believe the emotional intelligence comes into play, because, you know, what we're confronted with are these very, very complex environments. It's the complexity that makes them beautiful and attractive and desirable. But actually, a number of these interested stakeholders have got conflicting and opposing views. And I think we as engineers have a role to play in fundamentally understanding what those drivers are and then finding a way to resolve them and to address them for the benefit of the widest constituency within these communities, and do so in a way that's responsible to our finite natural resources of our planet.
And how do you see that reflected in projects that you've got in the office at the moment?
Well, I think one of the biggest projects that we've got at the moment, and we're fortunate to have a number of projects of this type, but one of the biggest ones at the moment is the Avenues in Glasgow. And in Glasgow, the city is fundamentally rewiring its urban infrastructure and taking the tarmac out of the town. We're seeing a reduction of maybe 60% of tarmac, and some of these magnificent streets with these really handsome mercantile buildings from this fantastic heritage that Glasgow has, which is difficult to appreciate when you're racing across 4 lanes of highway on these fantastic promenades such as Argyle Street or St Vincent Street or any of those other grand promenades across the city. So in this instance, the premise or the basis on which our commission is predicated is to create much more sociable spaces, provide much more meaningfully and safely for active travel, predominantly in the form of walking and cycling, but always making sure that public transport is straightforward and accessible, and doing so in a way that incorporates nature-based solutions. I appreciate that's a bit of a buzzword or buzz term at the moment, but for us, what that means is actually hardwiring in SUDS features in the form of rain gardens or trees or swales, whatever that might be, into a network that extends across the city centre, slows down the rate at which the water is absorbed into that network, and then slowly discharged back into the Clyde. So we're replicating natural geographic processes, and that has the additional benefit of actually increasing the amenity of the streets. But something that is missing from our spaces is actually biodiversity. And this provides the opportunity for habitat and the recolonization of our urban spaces by nature.
So as a practice, you've said that the government should mandate the use of timber on a large proportion of the building fabric, but in a similar way that France has done. I mean, this is pretty difficult to deliver politically, but important if we're going to meet zero carbon targets, isn't it? So what's the answer? Well,
we can't overlook the fact that Grenfell is the stain in our recent history, and the anxiety and tension that comes with anything that might be perceived as combustible applied to residential buildings especially. So I think we're going to have to just continue as a society, process that fact and attempt to come out the other side, because the impact that has had on the insurance markets and finance markets and property development viability and commercial metrics has been significant, and that still hasn't been exercised from our industry yet. So we can't overlook that significant, horrible experience our shared experience on that score. But yes, timber has huge potential, and we're seeing this. We are seeing some very positive signs because we're working with our clients over at Situ over in Leeds with the Climate Innovation District just on the south of the city. Or, you can see the product coming forward, the homes coming forward from the likes of Urban Splash with their house projects. Again, modern methods of construction, very cost effective, very, very high performing in terms of their thermal properties, but also intrinsically sustainable, a renewable source of materials and fabric.
But how do you convince government and local councillors to take a more scientific view of that aspect of fire? Because scientifically, CLT is pretty robust in fire, isn't it? More robust than steel in many cases.
Well, the markets unfortunately aren't always that rational, and I have recently, since January, been appointed as part of the Manchester Climate Change Partnership as chairperson for their zero carbon new build task force. And that team, which includes various professionals, consultants, but also financiers and property developers and landowners and Manchester City Council, are exploring this very specific issue to how to set out, map out, prepare a route map to get to that point very ambitiously by 2023 is the target, which actually is just around the corner. And I think it's setting those standards and communicating the benefits of those choices to the population at large for them to then want to invest or to spend or to buy or live, rather importantly, in homes that have that provenance and have those qualities. So I do think that it is heading in that direction, but like the rest of us, it can't happen fast enough. Although 2023 is very ambitious.
Well, I'm sure a group like that will be very powerful in changing the views of politicians and insurers as well. So, Stephen, thank you very much for your conversation today, and I look forward to meeting you soon in person.
My pleasure, Peter. Thank you very much for the invite. Much appreciated.